solves this diversity problem.
So much of the work has to be at the pipeline and access level, which is we have to get more people developed, we have to get more people rising up the ranks.
Google. Latinos make up just 2% of the tech workforce, African Americans 1%.
I think a culture of silence can be insidious. And I think a culture of vulnerability can be beautiful. A mantra that we've really tried to embrace here at Google is bring your full self to work. And I think it's challenging to bring your full self to work if you can't share who you are and what's going on in your life, what your background is, what your experiences are. As we've seen over the past several years, there's a lot of things that are happening in the world that are impacting people on a personal level. People are bringing more and more of the outside world into work and creating space for people to be vulnerable and talk about that, talk about what's happening in the world, talk about themselves is hugely important. We have various groups that are called ERGs, Employee Resource Groups, that focus on a variety of things, from serving the Black Googler community to the Hispanic Googler community to, we have another group called Gaglers, another group called VetNet, which is primarily focused on serving the veteran community. There's a lot of different ERGs, or employee resource groups, within the company. And one that I've gotten actively involved with from a leadership perspective is called Mosaic. Mosaic is focused on building community, primarily in the office, by fostering meaningful conversation. So some people in the office are going to be really interested in having conversations around police shootings. Some people are going to be really interested in having conversations around the Syrian refugee crisis. Some people are going to be really interested in having conversations around politics and the election. I think that the path to really bringing your full self to work for any team or company or group that decides to set that as their goal and as their vision is going to be a rocky one, because people grow up very, very differently. People believe very, very different things.
And we're not often aware of how our biases are actually already living inside of us, reinforced by culture and expressed in our behavior.
I think Google really tries to put the best ideas first, regardless of where they come from. Inclusion continues to be something that we really need to innovate around and work on. We continue to hire new people into the company. And so making it clear that we have a commitment to diversity and inclusion, especially on a local level here in Google Ann Arbor, is hugely important.
Welcome back, everybody. Glad you all could join us for another night. Happy Tuesday, another great week on this incredible web series entitled Our Village in Action. Super excited about tonight, the discussion. Actually, it's a two-part series. The discussion on recruitment and hiring of people of color. We've got some great panelists tonight, all professors, and then on Thursday, we do hope that you tune back in and invite some other folks to come. On Thursday, we'll be talking to a good number of women who are in leadership positions in corporate America who wear HR hats. So tonight we'll have the educational lens. On Thursday, come back, we'll have some great women talk about the corporate lens, all related to the recruitment and hiring of people of color. And I do hope over the next couple of nights that our guests are able to talk about some of the things related to COVID-19, how it has disproportionately placed people of color in awkward and uncomfortable positions. Many are essential employees, and you'll hear from some professors tonight who are going to kind of take that into even more detail. We are working on the great team that we have putting this Our Village in Action web series, working on a website. We spent some hours over the weekend and some time this week developing a website to hopefully go up next week so that you all can follow us. We hope to plan these web series a month in advance so that hopefully next week you'll have all of July, and in July you'll have the whole month of August, all the topics that we plan on discussing, and all the great panelists that we'll bring on. So I did want to bring that to your attention. And so without further ado, I do want to introduce our guests. I'm going to bring them on momentarily, but Dr. David Buckman is an associate professor. Dr. Arvin Johnson is also an associate professor, and Dr. Henry Tran is an associate professor. I'm going to have the gentleman come, and I'm going to unmute you all and ask that you share just a few thoughts about just yourselves, how you came into this work. I mean, this is some very important work, this HR field related to hiring and practices and systems that are in place. So Dr. Buckman, we'll start with you. Unmute your mic, and Dr. Johnson, followed by Dr. Tran.
Thank you, Dr. Otley. So with me, I'm originally from South Carolina. I spent some time in the South Carolina public school system as a teacher, coach, and also as an administrator. What led me into the human resources realm had a lot to do with my experiences in the school system, particularly when it came to hiring and people making the jump from teacher to leader. I felt that during that process that there was a lot of inequities that needed to be explored. So when I went to the University of South Carolina to receive my doctorate, that is the area that I decided to study, to learn more about, and try to understand some of those best practices in the selection and the hiring and recruiting, particularly when it comes to promoting teachers to leaders and to school administrators across different districts.
Good. Dr. Buckman, it's great to have you on tonight. Dr. Johnson?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Arvin Johnson. I am an associate professor now at Kennesaw State. However, prior to that, I spent 15 years as a public school administrator in Jacksonville, Florida. And that is where I got most of my experience with human resources. In fact, assistant principals and principals are typically the ones charged with recruiting, hiring, and maintaining employees. So I took on that role for quite some time. And I noticed that there are a lot of things that make the situation a lot more complex. And those are some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. So glad to be here.
Dr. Johnson, I do appreciate that, and also appreciate your lens from K-12. That'll be very helpful for tonight's discussion. And Dr. Tran.
Thank you. My name is Henry Tran. I'm Associate Professor of Education Leadership at the University of South Carolina, Director of the Talent-Centered Education Leadership Initiative, and the Associate Director of the Center of Innovation in Higher Education. I come from a former HR practitioner background. I've done HR work in the private sector and also in education. Now I'm a scholar and teacher of education, HR management. A lot of my research focused on issues of teacher recruitment and retention, and lately I've introduced the concept of talent-centered education leadership. And so really what that is a focus of inclusive talent management. Thank you.
We appreciate that. And those who are joining us by web tonight, please put in the chat box. If this is your first time tonight joining us, please put your email. Would love to place you on our list that we send out each and every week. And also want to be mindful that not only are we doing it this week, but next week we'll make sure we get the flyers out a lot sooner. We just thank you for your patience in doing so. If you have questions though for the panelists, please place those in the chat box. That is something that I'm going to be looking at for the next 35 minutes. I do have questions of my own. Those who have been on these calls before know how I flow, but we do want to make sure that we take some questions or comments from you. So feel free to place those in the chat box. Okay, David, Arvin, and Henry, this first question is discuss how COVID-19 has further exposed the recruitment and hiring practices for people of color.
Thank you, Jason. So essentially what COVID-19 did was it exposed what many people were already aware of, which is a two-tiered workforce system that we have. So what we found from latest reports is that Blacks and Latinos, Latinx individuals are more likely to be overrepresented and unemployed amidst the pandemic, and also among the essential frontline workers who need to stay in their job despite the virus going on, and many people are being asked to stay home. And a lot of these positions are particularly low-skilled positions where they're at greater risk of exposure to the virus. and they're also less likely to work from home. So for example, only 6% of the service sector workers are reported being able to work at home. Nearly a quarter of employed Hispanic, Black, and African American workers are employed in service industry jobs when you compare that to 16% of non-Hispanic whites. And so I'll focus a little bit more on the Black population just so that I can get more detailed. Can someone pull up this first slide? So the Black unemployment rate is 16.7% when compared with white unemployment rate of 14.2%. But that's not just an issue of education credentials. So as you can see here from the figure that I was able to obtain from the Economic Policy Institute, across all education levels, Black workers are more likely to be unemployed than white workers. And so that's, it's not, whether or not you have a bachelor's, a high school degree, advanced degree, et cetera, you see the same type of thing. Black workers are
Henry, can you read out some of those stats just for those who may not be able to see it? I don't know if they're with their phone or iPad or laptop. Just read out some of those numbers.
Sure. So overall, for example, it shows that Black workers are 6.1% more likely to be unemployed. That's the percentage of overall workers that are Black that are unemployed relative to white, which is 3%. And then and it breaks it down by category. For example, less than high school, you have 14.7%. Black that would be unemployed versus 8.3% white, and every category you're seeing the same type of trend. Is that it?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then going back to the second issue of Black workers being more likely to be in frontline jobs are categorized as essential, which basically means that they have to put themselves at risk. They have to put their families at risk and put other coworkers and customers at risk when they're out there in a time when people are being asked to stay home. So there was a recent study that was conducted with 6 sectors of the economy that are considered essential, and most of the workers are frontline COVID-19 labor market workers. And so if you can skip to the next slide. What we see here that Black workers make up 1 in 9 workers overall. They represent 11.9% of the workforce. However, Black workers make up 1 out of every 6 all frontline industry workers. So that means there are so Black workers are more likely to be unemployed, and when they are employed, they're more likely to be employed in positions that put them in harm's way during the COVID crisis. And like we mentioned before, a lot of these positions are lower paid positions, right? And so it goes a lot into this idea of the glass pyramid. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk in terms of like moving up in the industries and escalating to sort of corporate executive positions and whatnot. And so, what we're seeing here is the same thing I kind of just shared. For those of you who aren't able to see the figure, it says all Black workers as a share of all workers. For frontline workers, 17%. As a share of all workers, they're 11.9%. So it shows that they are more likely to be frontline workers. They're overrepresented in frontline worker positions. Mm. And then sort of just to kind of depress the matter further, there are also significant wage gaps. So Black men are paid only 71 cents on the white man's dollar in terms of sort of the economic policy analysis looked at this. And a lot of people, when they talk about this, they kind of neglect the conversation about women. And so I think you guys are addressing that on Thursday, but it's a really big issue because for a Black woman, they face not only race discrimination, but gender discrimination. And they're paid at even less on 64 cents of the white man's dollar. And so the underrepresented
those numbers again, Henry, because I want to really reiterate that the Black man's dollar to the white person's dollar.
Yeah, and so these are direct quotes from the Economic Policy Institute. So Black men are paid only 71 cents on the white man's dollar. Black women 64 cents on the white man's dollar. Okay. So when you're taking that comparison, and so why do we see that kind of gap? Well, one of the things is you see the underrepresentation of Black workers in high-paying wage professions, and their overrepresentation on low-wage positions, many of which are these frontline positions that we're talked about in the slide that I'm showing right now. And so that kind of just skews it towards the low end of the spectrum. And then even, when we talk about education degrees, it's the same thing. Black workers with advanced degrees experience more of a wage penalty when compared with their white counterparts. Now, a lot of people, when I'm from HR, right? So I talk about salaries is one thing, but then there's another thing about benefits. And so I don't know, I teach HR class, and when I teach it, sometimes people are surprised to find out not every job offers paid sick leave. So that is, if you take time off and you're approved for that time off, if you don't have an employer that offers paid sick leave or paid vacation and all those type of things, you're essentially basically losing money. right? And that's going to be less food that you can bring back to the table, et cetera. And so two particular benefits that are really important to talk about in this time period are paid sick leaves and the ability to work from home. And so if you, I think I have another figure that shows this. Yeah. So the figure here pretty much shows that, right? When you compare Black and white workers, how likely are they to obtain paid sick leaves and also working from home? And so paid sick leaves you see for Black workers, 58.7% compared to 66.6% for white workers. And then whether or not they can work from home for Black workers is 19.7%. Relative to 29.9% white workers. And so what you're seeing here a lot are it's fewer than 1 in 5 Black workers in the pre-pandemic economy were able to work from home. So these are just they're all interrelated issues. These are not separate issues, right? And this is also then tied back to, who makes it to executive positions, who are able to get positions where they can benefit from paid sick leave, paid benefits, your paid vacation, et cetera.
And we're going to talk a little bit more on Thursday about the corporate lens, through this corporate lens, but I want to stay on this slide just for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So, the paid sick days, those who could work from home, is this connected to or interrelated to the industry or the profession?
So this is across professions.
Okay.
So, when you work in certain jobs, you're more likely to get paid sick days. So for example, professional white collar jobs, for instance, relative to blue collar jobs. And then so it just talks about if you have a higher representation of individuals working in, for example, white collar jobs, those people are more likely to have sick days, benefits, et cetera. If you're working in lower paying jobs, a lot of the manual labor jobs, for instance, you're not going to receive those benefits. If they have you working part-time and you're not able to achieve those benefit gaps. So, people who know individuals who occupy those positions, they're very acutely aware of the fact that, this is not a benefit that everyone is privileged enough to get. Right.
Yeah. Looking at question 2, I'm thinking about education. I know working from home during this pandemic was available for most teachers. And so it created a digital divide, and certainly that's for another conversation. But for tonight, speaking more on education, why aren't schools hiring more people of color to teach students of color? I've noticed in some research that most staff of color in education are cooks and janitors. And then what message does this send to all students?
So Jason, I guess before I touch on why we need, why people aren't hiring more people of color, I kind of want to discuss a little bit about why we need to be hiring these individuals to kind of build that lens. So one of the issues that when you think about the population right now, the population is growing more and more diverse every year. And that also goes with the student population of the schools. But the issue is that the teaching force is not following suit. Some researchers even argue that the teaching force has moved in the opposite direction and is becoming less diverse and more homogeneously white. So there's 3 reasons that we should be hiring people of color as educators or as school leaders. One is because of role models. With so many people of color, particularly students, it's important to have people in front of their classrooms and leading their schools that look like them. Another one is cultural synchronicity. So with this view, it holds that students of color benefit from being taught by teachers of color because they may share similar life experiences and have insider knowledge. So research has indicated that the positive impact of cultural synchronicity on students' outcomes is unprecedented. So that's one of the issues that even at the college level, it's important to have people of color leading those classrooms as well to kind of increase the student achievement metrics for those students, have more positive outcomes with graduations and such. Another issue, the third one, is the shortage of teachers in disadvantaged schools, where the research has also indicated that teachers of color often are more likely to take a humanistic commitment to make a difference in the lives of disadvantaged students. So when you have these disadvantaged urban school districts that may be Title I, where they struggle to get teachers, they have high turnover rates, they find that people of color may be more interested in working in those environments because of that humanistic commitment. So you ask, why aren't schools hiring people of color? So if you think back historically, back to Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregating of schools, large numbers of Black educators were removed from schools, which led to a sharp decrease in the numbers of teachers of color. So that kind of already shows you, even looking back into the 50s and 60s, when all this was taking place, and even in the 70s, you had a surplus of Black teachers. And they all were teaching in all Black schools. But when they desegregated schools, some of those teachers went to the desegregated schools, and then many of them were laid off or removed. So that automatically started developing that culture. So if you follow that trend, research has also supported that the lack of teachers of color is not because they're being discriminated against during the selection process, but it's an inadequate labor pipeline into the teaching occupation. So even when I've done research with local school districts here in Georgia, many of them say that we are highly interested in hiring people of color. It's just that we don't have people in their pool. And I think we're going to touch on that later about some ways to recruit people of color as well. So another thing, so although the number of students of color who graduate college has increased, the research also indicated when minority candidates seek to enter into teaching, teacher certification, entry tests, and other forms of assessment tend to, I guess, hold these individuals back. And I know even outside the lens of education, we start thinking about lawyers and doctors, the MCATs, LSATs, SATs, people of color as a whole tend to score lower on these type of tests. And in order to receive a teaching license, typically you have to pass some form of assessment or test to be licensed. And that also serves as a gatekeeper. So you don't have people who are eligible to serve as teachers because of those types of these tests and such. So another instance in teacher retention, lack of representation of people of color may also be that the population has higher turnover rates than whites. So when you look at the school, it may be that they are hiring people of color, but they're not retaining them. And the data also shows that that people of color tend to turn over at higher levels. So it's also those supports that the school, so it's not just getting them in, but are they supported? Do they understand the needs of teachers and leaders of color within the district? And are they providing professional development to maintain them throughout their matriculation, throughout their career, to keep them? So it's more of a pipeline issue that could also be stated. But I mean, these issues, there have been attempts to address these through different policies. So some organizations, such as Education Commission of States, the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, National Collaborative on Diversity, and the Teaching Force, have all advocated for setting up these pipelines, encouraging people of color to go into the teaching field. I think even in the Southeast, I don't know if this is in the northern area, but the Call Me Mr. program, that's big around here, that also recruits African-American males into the education field. So in some, it's not as simple as what it may seem that, oh yeah, they're just not hiring them, and that they see that they're discriminating against people who are interviewing and things of that nature. It's more about getting people into the pipeline. I know the second part of your question, well, third part, you asked about the representation being found with cooks and janitors. I think that also ties back into what I was saying earlier about the licensing process. So typically in education, you have certified staff and classified staff. Certified, those individuals have to be licensed. Typically that also is accompanied with a college degree, probably at the bachelor's level or higher, depending on what the position is they're actually applying for. Whereas with staff, you may have associate degrees. Some of these individuals don't have to be licensed. So I guess when you look at that track and what some of these issues would be systemically in terms of the tests and the licensing and the schooling, you may find people who live in those communities are more able or better able to enter to the schools in those capacities as opposed to in the licensed position. So what does that say to the students who see these individuals? I mean, I guess it can say a lot when you don't see a lot of people like you in positions, if you even want to think of it from a wage perspective or a wage hierarchy, the higher paid individuals, the administrators, the teachers, the ones who are leading, if you don't see a lot of people like you in those situations, it will make you speculate and make you feel like this is where should I be aspiring to be, because I don't see myself in these individuals. I haven't had, for me particular, African-American male teach my class to kind of let me understand what I need to be doing to be more like them, to aspire to a high level. So yeah, it can say a lot.
Yeah, and Langston Hughes' dream is deferred. It's not even a deferred dream.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dream that's not even a reality for many students, of color who don't see someone, at that particular level. Like you ask students in class, like, what do you want to be when you grow up, right?
Right.
And so you ask students of color that question, Black students particularly, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then they say things like, a musician, a rapper, a singer, a dancer, right? They're not choosing some of these professions, teaching. Why? Because they don't maybe not see it in the school. Arvin, you worked as a principal, now professor. If you could speak to the same question, and I'd also like you to even consider the retention piece, Arvin. Why is it hard to retain staff of color who have passed these exams that David mentioned, right? Getting into the pipeline is already hard enough, but why is it hard to keep them once they've made it in?
Right, great question. So it's hard to speak about that in generalities, but I will tell you that often African-American teachers are placed in the most troublesome courses, and they have the most troublesome students, particularly in schools that have a lot of minorities in it. They're not getting the AP classes, they're not getting the advanced classes, they're getting those courses where students struggle a lot. And even your best teacher can be burned out, particularly if they're doing that year after year after year, because it's quite a serious demand on their time and just their cognitive ability. So that's one of the reasons why retention becomes an issue, because a lot of Black and teachers of color simply get burnt out because they're given those not troublesome, but those challenging roles, and they're kind of pigeonholed into those positions. Another reason is that they're often charged with discipline and the go-to person for discipline. So if you're acting out in Mr. Jones's class, I'm going to send you to Arvin Johnson's class because he's a strong disciplinarian. Well, what a lot of times administrators and other teachers don't know is that load every day of dealing that wears on those individuals too. And at some point it comes to a breaking point where they say, okay, maybe I need to transfer to another school, or I just need to transfer out of the teaching profession altogether because I'm not getting the support that I need, and I'm always getting the most challenging students. So I think part of that is the responsibility of assistant principals and principals to make sure that there's some sort of equitable rotation in the teaching assignments. And that's just one example that I can come up with that I saw over and over again as a K-12 administrator.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Lynn. I want to...
Jason, can I jump in on this a little bit too?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. So Jason, you could probably speak on this a lot more depth than I do, given that your background in race scholarship. But according to a lot of social justice scholarship, many schools are not really places that are welcoming for students of color, particularly brown and Black students. And so they're, they're overrepresented in disciplinary action. They're less likely to graduate, et cetera. So, thinking about it from that lens, why would a student who's gone through all that and been treated that way want to return back to the school to then further work for them for the rest of their career? And then you couple that with a negative reputation and attacks that's been lodged against the teaching profession. It just makes it very unattractive for students of color or people of color to want to do that. I want to jump on a little bit about what Arvin mentioned, the idea of, stereotypes, for example, and, Black men being seen as disciplinarians. And so therefore we should send the troubled students, the disciplinary issue students to that particular person. When you think about elevation to sort of a promotion in administrative position, like for example, let's say a teacher would like to become a principal, right? If they're an AP and they're working discipline all the time, their instructional chops are not valued. So they're the police, but they're not really. But at the end of the day, we're a school. We care about instructional improvement, and you haven't shown me that you can do that. You just showed me you can manage. You can watch all the bad kids, etc. And so that can hurt students. And then just thinking hurt a person of color in the promotional endeavors, and then thinking about what it constitutes as quality and effectiveness, right? So, for example, if you can speak Spanish and you can connect to students who speak primarily Spanish, is that an asset to the school? Some administrators do not see that as an asset. They'll say, well, we're in America, you should be speaking English. So you need to connect with your kids in English. And so that kind of, that creates somewhat a hostile environment for this individual who feels like their assets, or at least what they believe to be what they're bringing to the school, are not valued. So that creates an exclusionary environment that makes them may not want to stay. And when we see this kind of stuff all the time, I mean, even in higher education, we talk about faculty of color often having a higher load in terms of mentoring and supporting students of color, because they're more likely to see someone and say, oh, this person looks like me, let me talk to that person. But that type of work, depending on the institution, may not be valued. Yeah, so all of those things just create an extra burden for the individuals.
You're right, Henry. I just wrote that note to myself. There are no rewards. You're absolutely right. In K-12 and in higher education, those teachers and faculty of color who are putting in all this time, mentorship, after-school programs, creating, young women of color initiatives, young men of color initiatives. They're not rewarded for this work, right? And they end up burning out, although they're really helping to create community among students and to change really the culture and climate of the school system. It really bites them kind of in the butt, because there's no reward, there's no upward mobility, there's no accolades that really fall in line with this type of work. So I'm glad that you all mentioned kind of that burnout piece. I want to just pause for a second. I want to show this quick video, and I want to shift just a little bit into the recruiting, hiring, and retaining of employees.
If you want to survive, this is not a question of, again, the right thing to do. This is a question of a must do. If it's a must do, you have to hold people accountable. It might be compensation. I love the Rooney Rule in the FL, where every slate must be diverse. Because you'll be surprised that people always say, we couldn't find anyone. It's so funny when you're black, or, I think it's the same for people who are Hispanic. We're like, we know a lot of people. What are you talking about? I can give you 10 names right now. We're like, what are you talking about? But, when you have to force the hand, they're always kind of surprised when they find us. It's like, I didn't even know you existed. Like, I've been here for a long time, and there's 1,000 of me. So I think just making that commitment, more than just saying that it's something you strive for, having the diversity offer report directly to you as a CEO. Making sure that compensation of senior leaders is tied to having diverse teams. Really calling people out on this issue.
Yeah, the question, I think, was a very valiant question. How do we hold people accountable? This next question, I want to kind of get into the system, because I don't think it's a person that we are holding accountable. I think it's a system that needs to be held accountable. And so, gentlemen, is the system that's been created, designed for corporate, for education, for nonprofit, for business sectors, is that system of recruiting, hiring, and then retaining employees, is it just designed for white employees and not employees of color?
Okay, great question, Dr. Otley. So I like to say that, most of the commonly used systems of recruiting, hiring, and retaining employees lead to white employees being privileged in certain roles, right? And so for me, I can speak from the vantage point of a prior K-12 administrator, and from the vantage point of now a faculty member in educational leadership, whose primary charge is developing school leaders and getting them ready to lead schools. So I'm going to specifically speak about recruiting, hiring, and retaining school administrators of color. First of all, these are the folks that typically are responsible for hiring others and supporting others. So they play a huge role in what you just talked about, right? And so I think that before we begin to look at how do we rectify this, there are certain things that school districts can do, and there are certain things that university preparation programs can do. So I'll start first by saying that with school leader preparation, most of this is done through the state level, through university preparation programs, right? You go through and you get your certification to become a school leader, you meet state requirements, and then you find a job, right? But in some of my research, what I found is that this university preparation is only the foundation. It must be supplemented with ongoing professional learning and capacity building. Now that comes in different forms. It may be through district developed leadership programs. It may be through professional learning that's individually pursued. And it also may be through job embedded learning. So a couple of things we can do from the university and a couple of things that school districts can do. At the university level, we have to make sure that we are designing and modifying our curriculums to ensure that issues of race, equity, and access are thoroughly embedded throughout the curriculum, not just in one class on equity and diversity. It needs to be intentional and embedded throughout our curriculums. Another thing is we need to make sure that those individual candidates coming out of colleges of education, that they are adequately prepared to address issues of race, equity, and access. And because I'll tell you, this is also transferable to any organization. If these issues are not deemed important by the leadership, you will not see practices and policies in place in those institutions. So that's why it's important that we prepare our leaders to address those issues. And another thing, at the university level, professors must be willing to lean into uncomfortable conversations with students, particularly when students have an ideology that is detrimental to race, equity, and access. We have to be willing to confront those issues with our students before they leave our program and go into schools or either other organizations and hurt diversity efforts or hurt the workplace. Now I'll shift a little bit. So there are a lot of other things that we can be doing at the university level, but those are just to highlight a few. Now, when I think about what's going on in school districts across the nation, there are some things that could be done to help increase employees of color, right? And these things are transferable to other institutions as well. First off, a lot of school districts recruit from their local university, recruit students from their local universities. What I would ask is that school districts look at partnering with HBCUs in their area, particularly those HBCUs who have colleges of education. And what partnering means is allowing those students from those HBCUs to serve as student teachers, to also complete some of the administrative internship requirements that are required before they go into those administrative roles within the schools. School districts need to be inviting these HBCUs to participate in their hiring fairs so that those students have access to the jobs and what's going on in school districts. I think school district leaders need to make sure that they're being supportive of their school-based leaders, but also holding them accountable for recruiting, hiring, and maintaining a diverse workplace. Typically, we want the student demographics to mirror the staff. I mean, we want the staff demographics to mirror the student demographics. Now, can you get that clean in every instance? Absolutely not. But there are some things you can do to work towards that. And I think that, you know, that will help us move in the right directions. I think that school districts have to ensure that our schools embrace a climate and culture that focuses on inclusivity. School districts have to be intentional and strategic about developing diverse human resource plans and making sure that schools have diversity of thought among faculty and staff. And that speaks to how schools are evaluated. Now, schools across the nation have different ways of evaluating schools. However, the most common denominator in that would be student achievement outcomes. But there are some qualitative areas that I think schools and state boards of education need to take a look at. And those are some of the areas of how diverse are the faculty and staff, how diverse are their thought, and how much do the policies focus on diversity and equity. So,
hey, Arvin, let me pause you for a second and ask you this question, because you mentioned, you know, bringing people of color into more of these roles. And so what's coming to mind now is this idea of representation, or this idea of tokenism, right? And
right.
But the central question is the system, right? And if the system is changed, right, even if we bring people in of color, does that really change the system?
Yeah, good question. So the idea is that if we bring in more people of color, that's going to add more diversity of thought, which in turn could lead to some more systemic changes. And you're exactly right. Where we are now has evolved through institutional systemic racism for years. So it's going to take that same type of solution where we're not just bringing in the people, but we're bringing in the right people to change the way the system operates and to create policies that eliminate that old paradigm where, you know, only certain people rise to certain levels. And at least if we get people at the table, we can then start to work on some of the policies.
Okay, I like that. Right people to change the system, then amend and design new policy. I like that. Henry, go ahead on this.
Sure. I think that, you know, the effects of an inequitable education system are perpetuated and magnified when you have an inequitable employment system. I'll share some interesting stats I found. From Fortune 500, there are only 5 Black CEOs right now on 2020 Forbes Fortune 500 list. And so when you're looking at women, there's 37 women, only 3 of them are women of color, and there's 0 that are Black. In fact, in the history of Fortune 500, there's only been 1 Black woman who has ever held a Fortune 500 in a non-interim CEO role. So I think that tells you a lot about, we talk, and all of these questions are related, right? The question you asked me in the beginning, the second question. So, why do we see, for example, more people of color working in, low-paying, low-skilled positions, et cetera. And then when we get closer, higher to the top, in Fortune 500, since 1999, there's only been 18 Black CEOs.
Wow.
The peak was 6 in 2012. So you're talking about Fortune 500, right? 500 companies. So that tells you a lot about sort of what we're seeing. And it's not a performance issue, right? So there's many, many reports, right? There's the McKinsey and Companies report, Lean In and SurveyMonkey. There's all sorts of different reports that have been conducted to look at the benefits of diversity from a financial organizational outcome perspective. Not just, oh, yes, we have more diverse thought, but does this affect the bottom line? And research has found that organizations in the top 25% of ethnic and cultural diversity are more likely to achieve above average profitability. 33% if you have diversity in your executive team, 43% if your board of executives are diverse. So, I can pull all sorts of stats and numbers to show you that, but we repeatedly see this pattern. So it's not an issue of performance. And where a lot of the bottleneck happens in these institutions, for example, one of the things they did was they tried to formalize systems, right? They'll say, okay, well, you know what, in order to mitigate discrimination, we're gonna have open call systems. So we're gonna post a job and everyone applies for the job. Now, anyone who knows kind of how these things kind of work behind the scene knows that sometimes a lot of employers already have someone in mind for that posting, right? So you're applying for a job you have no shot at because we've already, designated John over here to take that job. And it's a lot of that tacit behind the scenes things, and I'll talk about, how we can address some of these things later. And also thinking about networks, right? A lot of people get jobs from who they know. Well, if the upper echelons of the organization are primarily one demographic group of people, and people most likely hang out or communicate and trust one another, right? They're more likely to tap those people to move into similar positions. And some of these are not like, I'm not talking about just, outright racism, like I don't like you as a person, therefore I'm not promoting you. It's actually more of an issue a lot of times of just, I trust someone who looks more like me and who can speak like I do. And that sometimes that happens on racial terms. A lot of times it does. Sometimes it happens on, other things. Like, for example, we both talk sports. oh, you watch football too? I also watch football. All of a sudden now I like you more. Nothing to do with your job performance, just because we have that that connection. So in the literature calls that homosocial reproduction, right? You're just essentially cloning people who are like you and then putting those people in similar positions because those are the people you trust.
Even Henry, but you just read the statistic that show that revenue increases, right? Creativity is increased when you have diverse thought, right? You're able to expand more when you have more diversity. So even with those numbers and figures, why is it not a priority, right? To diversify and to change the culture and climate and redesign the system.
And see, and Jason, I kind of want to jump in right here too with some of the experience I've had with doing research in some of the K-12 schools as well. Is just when you start looking at hiring for diversity, when you're looking at these leaders, these people making these decisions, what is their motivation? Why do they want to hire for diversity? What are they trying to meet? You know, so are they trying to meet a quota? Is it something that the state said that we need to have a diverse population of teachers, so you're doing it? Or do you actually see the value add in having a more diverse group of leaders and teachers in your school? Looking at the research that I stated earlier about the student outcomes, looking at having someone in your central office who is a person of color that brings that perspective that can make your district better. And I think that's some of the issues that I've noticed when I was speaking with some of the HR folks about hiring for diversity or things of that nature. What are you doing to do it? Are you making this something in your program where you're going not just with recruiting, not just with, are you actually changing your job application process to make sure that you're meeting these needs? Are you using these job postings to address issues of racial and cultural diversity that may also lend to that? Do you even know what the community thinks about your organization? Because it may not be that it may be a reason that these individuals are not applying and trying to come to your school district or your organization because of your reputation. Are you using that to change the narrative? So I think a lot of that stuff, and I know Henry's going to touch on some more of those best practices, but a lot of those are kind of tied in it. What is your motivation? Because if you're just trying to meet the quota to have a person of color in a seat, then yeah, you're going to continue to have this revolving door of people of color coming in and out, but not having any substantial impact.
And by the way, that quota thing is illegal. So you know, interestingly enough, and I think you shared this, David, Arvin, and myself wrote a paper on this, and we looked at sort of, you know, how people address diversity issues, and we presented a diversity problem for schools, and we talk about how you might actually, you know, unearth the real way, as opposed to sort of like, oh, well, we need to hire, all we got to do is hire this person of color, and then boom, our problems are solved. You know, I want to go back to this question a little bit though. Some of the things that are perpetuated. So I talked a lot about unconscious bias and how, you know, individuals will more likely recommend each other because they trust each other. But there's also, you know, what constitutes, you know, performance, I mentioned, what constitutes professionalism, right? Earlier today, before our session began, we talked about like what would be professional. You know, you have to dress professionally, you have to look professional. Well, what type of hairstyles are considered professional? That has been a big thing, right? You know, we've seen it at the school level, we've seen it, and then, you know, you trained in it in the school level, and then you kind of see it as the same thing when you're in the workforce. Whether or not a head wrap is professional, Abercrombie and Fitch actually got sued and lost money as a result of that, because they decided that having a head wrap was not the you know, according to the policy of Abercrombie and Fitch's attire, right? And they were like, well, you know, that's discrimination, because who are more likely to wear head wraps? You know what I'm saying? So a lot of this kind of, and it actually, it's, you know, it's legally like that violates the disparate impact and disparate treatment doctrine. Like you're talking about different things that happen, but many people aren't talking about it. When you talk about what is legitimate to discuss in the workplace, what is appropriate to discuss, these are the type of things that continue to shut people of color out if what they consider normal, for instance, is not considered normal by the organization's standpoint. So you asked about systems, so that's how I kind of wanted to address that.
Yeah, that system piece. I mean, I think we could even, you know, stay on that. I'm just thinking about the system, you know, of hiring. Well, first of all, let's go to recruiting. I'm hearing that individuals, organizations, school systems, when they're looking for employees, they're not always going to the places to cast a wide net. And Henry, I think it goes back to your point earlier, when you are at the top and the top is all white, your net is going to be kind of where your access kind of remote center is. So how do organizations, schools even, how do they begin to create a system to cast a wider net to even bring in more diverse talent?
Yeah, so I would think it all goes back to one, preparation of the leaders, making sure that when leaders are prepared, that them knowing what the data say about how diversity helps an organization, it helps an institution, embedding that data in curriculums, making sure that they appreciate that when they're prepared to become leaders or they're prepared to be in leadership role. That's one step. And then the next step, I believe, is making sure that we get some diversity at the upper echelons of leadership in all institutions, which is sometimes easier said than done. But I think if we go back to the way leaders are prepared, that may help us to start to change that paradigm some.
Another one I would say is build relationships. So it's not just having a recruitment fair where you stand at a table and grab people walking by and tell them about your programs or tell them about your school. It's more about getting into those schools, like Dr. Johnson said, talking to some of those, at least in education, talking to those principal or teacher preparation programs, talking to some of those professors, get to know them, come speak to the class where they see you as an individual as opposed to just standing amongst many. Because sadly, most of the recruiting in K-12 takes place at recruiting fairs, as opposed to, I'm not going to say go informal, but having a stronger touch on your environment and the people and the organizations. So they know that, oh yeah, well, Dr. Johnson came here and spoke to me and talked about his district. He spoke to me individually in the classroom and so forth. I mean, even if you think of it just like with the NFL or any other sports agencies, there's a lot of hands touching those elite players to try to get them to come there. There's a lot of phone calls that are taking place. So it's not just, I want you, you come here. It's more building those relationships, because those relationships will actually get them to come.
And some employers just post a job ad on their website and just think that people will come and apply there. They don't do any type of proactive recruitment.
Good advertising. Yeah. I know we're short on time. I want to ask this kind of like large question. It kind of starts with a quote, and I think each of you probably have something to really shed on this. I recently read that Uber has probably changed the racial dynamic in the cab industry, right? Because of Uber, cabs can't afford to discriminate against people of color any longer. The cab industry had no choice but to change or would go out of business. America needs a shift change, similar to Uber. What will allow for the practices of the organizations to develop a redesign to create more equitable working environments?
So I'll say that I think that highlighting the benefits of having a more diverse workplace, highlighting that and making it front and center, and educating some of these industry leaders on the benefits, showing them what the data tell them, and showcasing that. I think that's one step in the direction. Because once we start to talk about funds and funding, that always it leads to change, particularly if you're showing folks how to increase funds or how to avoid losing revenue.
I think, one of the things organizations should do is pay attention to what recruitment initiatives work, recruitment and retention initiatives work and don't work. And I'm so glad that we talked about this issue of retention, even though the presentation headline was about recruitment, because, increase of representation is necessary but insufficient. When you focus on hiring, organizations will think that they got the job done if we've hired the person. It's a sort of a check in the box. And me and David talked about this the other day. It's like, oh, we're trying to hire a person, but we already got one. We don't need to hire another one. We hired a Sam, right? And so it becomes this whole idea of tokenism, and then there's a whole treatment of, well, that's a diversity hire. So then that person comes with all the baggage of like, people, they'll get the impression that the individual only got the job because the person was a diversity hire versus that person actually has the merit to, to earn the job. And it goes into like, so then they'll be like, oh yeah, that's a diversity hire. Well, why is diversity juxtaposed with quality? That's the thing. That's the thing we ask, right? So people say we got diversity. Well, why can't they be the same thing? Why does it have to be that we reduce quality in order to hire somebody, hire a more diverse body? And one of the most popular programs that are used by organizations is, you guys ever heard of anti-bias diversity training? So the idea is that you come in and they train managers and whatnot about their unconscious biases and how that perpetuates discrimination. And then through that training, they can then say, oh, we'll make more cognizant decisions and how to avoid it. But by itself, those programs have not been found to be very effective. And I'll talk about several reasons why. One, they're very short in duration. Too short to actually have any type of meaningful change. Second, at the end of these type of trainings, there's usually like some sort of exam you take. Well, essentially, people have to do all they have to do is learn how to answer the questions correctly. That does not require any change in their behavior. So, okay, I need to be fair. I need to make sure I'm not discriminating people, yada, 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 yada. And then they go back and then they do whatever they do, right? A lot of people see it as a waste of time if they don't buy into the idea of diversity. And, they just kind of feel like this is gonna, it's basically shaming me. I'm going to sit here the whole time and it's going to tell me how, all this stuff I do is bad and how I need to change this, that, the other. And then there's also a lot of negative messaging that comes with it. Like, you need to change this. We're going to get sued here, da, 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 da. Some research has actually suggested that these type of trainings can actually increase prejudice. And so the people walk out feeling like, okay, I'm coming into this program and I'm going to and this program is just going to be anti-white, anti-straight, and people start feeling resentful, and then they start feeling like they are discriminated. So it triggers the very bias that the program was designed to mitigate. And a lot of research has suggested this, right? A lot of people don't like what they call thought policing. Like, I'm coming in here, you're stripping me of my autonomy, and you're telling me how I should think. When people feel pressure to agree with something, they sometimes lash out against it. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you guys are familiar. So the rapper Kanye West, producer, people asked him, like, why are you a Trump supporter, right? Why are you repping the MAGA hat and all that? And his response was, everyone says because I'm black, I have to be anti-Trump. I don't like being told what to do. All my life, people told me I couldn't be a producer and a rapper, and I'm one of the most successful in the game. So it's sort of that, like, people don't like to be pushed into a box, right? So they kind of lash out. So you tell me I'm not going to be discriminatory, and then they're just going to find ways to work around it. What needs to happen is there has to be a true engagement so that person voluntarily says, yes, this is the correct thing to do. And this is, and so this is why I want to do it, not because my organization is forcing me to do it. So then, given that, why are programs like this so popular? I think it's primarily because of a PR reason. Organizations that have diversity training can then say, we have a diversity training. And then people feel better about it because they're like, well, there can't be discrimination. Here we got a diversity training. Everybody went through a diversity training, right? But when you see that even when these organizations have diversity trainings for years, and then you look at the makeup of their employees and it doesn't change, that tells you a lot, right? You have programs like targeted college recruitments. Arvin and I were talking about the other day, sort of approaching like HBCUs and proactively recruiting students of color. Those programs have been found to be more effective. Mentoring programs, right? We talked a lot about, well, if you know someone higher in the game, you're more likely to, know the ropes, all the tacit knowledge that people don't tell you about, and move up. Well, if you get a mentor, that person can serve that, and the mentor may be someone different than you, then they're more likely to know you and advocate for you, and then that can help individuals. And then there's other things like self-managed teams and diversity task forces that have been found to boost diversity metrics in businesses. I think that's, I don't know if anyone wants to chime in. I have a lot more to talk about in terms of that, but it's a lot of,
No, that's good stuff, Henry. Yeah.
It's a lot of information that people don't know about.
Yeah, you dropping some nuggets, some gems, some diamonds, man. I really appreciate that. Hey, Arvin and David, did you guys have any last thoughts before we close out for the night?
Yep. Yeah, I'll go quickly. So I looked at one of the questions in the chat box, and I just want to briefly kind of respond to it. We talked about should we prepare students to be entrepreneurs, and I think yes, we should. We've had a lot of failed efforts with that in the area of vocational schools and so on and so forth. But I think what educational systems need to do is to be able to prepare students to think critically, to think creatively, and to think about the world in an unorthodox manner. And that will lead to more entrepreneurism.
I like that. David?
Yeah, I think everybody's covered most of the good, most of all the good stuff. I would just kind of lean back on the emphasis that schools have to understand the value add to what diversity does for their organization. And I think again, too many are just checking boxes, trying to meet quotas, and just trying to address whatever the state's telling them they need to do, as opposed to taking an authentic approach to hiring for diversity. Because if you're just meeting that quota, you will never accomplish what your school could accomplish if they actually came in it with a organized, strategic, authentic manner.
Yeah. Well, David, Arvin, and Henry, I learned a lot. My notebook is out, and I'm taking notes. I mean, you guys dropped some incredible nuggets tonight, things that I did not know about, things that I now want to go research.